After the worst performance of his entire career, Bengals fans and fantasy owners are left asking, is Andy Dalton really this bad? And with Josh McCown and Ryan Mallett set to start for their respective teams this weekend, what should fantasy owners be doing with the likes of Mike Evans, Vincent Jackson, Andre Johnson, and DeAndre Hopkins? Also, should fantasy owners be listening to the rumors of the return of Randy Moss to the NFL if he might play for the Denver Broncos? I'll be answering your Week 10 lineup questions from YouTube and Twitter, and I'll give you my busts and sleepers for this week's games. It's all on today's episode of the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. I am your host, Nick, also known as Kliquid, and I am here twice a week, every week, to answer your questions and give you the advice that you need to win your fantasy football leagues. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about on today's episode is the thumping that the Cleveland Browns gave to the Cincinnati Bengals this past Thursday night on Thursday Night Football, 24-3. And that was on the road. Cleveland went into Cincinnati and beat them 24-3. Now, granted, the road still meant that it was in the same state. They're both in Ohio, but these are divisional rivals, and there's absolutely no love lost between the Bengals and the Browns. These are consistently some of the best games that we have on a yearly basis in the NFL. And even when the teams are bad, they usually play each other really, really close. But man, 24-3 on the road, that is so surprising. I did not see that coming at all. I think most people saw the Bengals walking away with a win in this one, especially when you had AJ Green returning from injury. But Andy Dalton was absolutely atrocious. This is a guy who signed a $100 million contract, and then he goes 10 of 33 for 86 yards and 3 interceptions on the night. Unbelievable. Now, AJ Green caught only 3 passes for 23 yards. Mohamed Sanu only 2 for 20 yards. Just an atrocious, awful, just inexcusable day for this defense. Now, I know, obviously, the Browns have guys like Joe Hayden. I get it. Tashawn Gibson, not a bad player. But you cannot come out and put up 3 points on the board at home when you're trying to win the division title, and that's what they're trying to do there in the AFC North. I mean, this is a division that every team right now is very, very good in that division, and really any team could win the division. But you look at it and you see a team go out there and put up 3 points on the board against the Browns, and you just have to question if this is really the year for the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, keep in mind, the running game was actually fairly productive. Jeremy Hill rushed for more than 4.5 yards per carry, but he only got 12 attempts. I mean, that's what happens when your team falls behind multiple scores in a game. The Browns played ball control football in this one. They ran the ball a total of 52 times. 52 times. And that meant that all 3 of their running backs ended up scoring a touchdown. First, if I remember correctly, first it was, I want to say it was Ben Tate first, and then it was Isaiah Crowell, and then finally Terrence West got into the end zone. Now, Terrence West did lead the team with 26 carries for 94 yards, and he appears to be getting the bulk of the carries, but this job is not secure at all. I mean, like, you look at a week-to-week basis, and you could see Ben Tate get the most carries. You could see Isaiah Crowell sneak up there, and especially when they're giving the goal line carries to all 3 of the guys, and nobody's really getting consistent carries at the goal line, it's very, very hard to determine who is going to have a quality fantasy game and who's going to go out there and get, 12 attempts for 46 yards and no touchdowns. It's very, very difficult when you look at it from a fantasy standpoint. And that's why I'm just not super excited anymore about this Cleveland Browns running game. I was pretty excited when it looked like Ben Tate was coming back and he was really successful, but if it's going to be a 3-headed quote-unquote monster like this, I don't like it. I really don't. Terrence West is the guy you want to own right now in this backfield if you were going to own somebody, but even him, you just look at it and is he going to get 20 carries a game? I just don't see it. I mean, I think that they're going to continue to be a ball control offense. I mean, that's how they're going to win Brian Hoyer's not going to light up the world on a week-to-week basis, but even still, I look at this as just being not a great situation. It's so hard to believe that he's going to touch the ball 20 times in a game. So it's a very weird game that we saw on Thursday night. And Thursday night games can be pretty weird because you only get that 3 to 4 days to actually sit down and prepare for the team. But it's still very, very worrisome to me right now that the Cincinnati Bengals are so bad at passing the ball at the moment. Now, AJ Green, I look at him still, despite the fact that this offense was so bad, as a buy low candidate. And the reason for it is because despite the fact that they were terrible at throwing on Thursday Night Football, I still think that AJ Green is going to get healthier. And when he's 100%, or even if he's at 90 or 80%, he's still a top 10 wide receiver as far as talent goes in the NFL. He's coming off of an injury, had a bad game on Thursday Night Football, and the quarterback had the worst game of his career. So I look at this as being a buy low for AJ Green right now. I do think it gets better from here for him. I mean, it would be hard for it to get worse, obviously, but I believe that AJ Green will be a top 10 to top 15 wide receiver for the remainder of the year. So if you can get him at a discount, I'm telling everybody right now to go out there and try and acquire AJ Green. I do still think that there are going to be good games for him from here on out for the remainder of the season. Next thing that I want to start to talk about is a little bit more of another quarterback situation that's brewing. Tampa Bay has sat down Mike Glennon. They are moving back to Josh McCown, who they had, I know he had gotten hurt, but it would kind of almost been like he had been benched as well. And then the Texans are moving to Ryan Mallett, sitting down Ryan Fitzpatrick. So they're moving from Ryan to Ryan. I'm expecting that my buddy Ryan, xRyan915 on YouTube, is probably going to be next in line at the quarterback position for the Texans. But for right now, you look at that situation as being a pretty interesting one. There's a lot to like about what you see in Ryan Mallett. I mean, he's going to be getting his first real NFL action since being drafted by the Patriots in the third round of the 2011 NFL draft. But the scouting reports were that this guy had a huge arm, but he kind of lacked the accuracy and made some questionable decisions. Now, of course, when you've sat behind Tom Brady for the majority of your career and you've been working with Bill O'Brien for a few years now, I'm sure that he's starting to learn how to read NFL defenses a little bit better. But a lack of accuracy and poor decision-making is kind of the thing that got Ryan Fitzpatrick benched. So it's kind of interesting that they're going to a guy who all reports on when he was coming out of college were that those were his major issues. So who knows how long this experiment will last, but I mean, the fact that he's worked with Mallett, or Ryan Mallett has worked with Bill O'Brien for so long, I should say, and it's just the fact that he has that relationship with him, and he decided to actively pursue Ryan Mallett in the offseason. It's kind of, I think this is kind of an interesting situation. I think that there's something to look at here. I think we need to look at what he does this weekend, see what kind of production he has. Now, I'm not expecting a monster game out of Ryan Mallett by any means, and I do think you have to downgrade Andre Johnson and DeAndre Hopkins a little bit right now until we actually see what Mallett can do. But if he comes out and he looks solid, I think that this could be a good situation going forward. I mean, when you look for a guy who has a big arm that can get the ball down the field to an Andre Johnson and to a DeAndre Hopkins, that's what Ryan Mallett is. He's going to give these guys an opportunity to make the plays on the ball that I don't think Ryan Fitzpatrick really had the skills to do. So it's going to be an important weekend here for the Houston Texans. Will they actually have a chance here at finding themselves a future franchise quarterback, or are they going to be drafting another quarterback here in 2015? It's hard to say, but we will definitely get a glimpse of it this weekend. The other thing, obviously, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers quarterback situation, as we look at that, Josh McCown lost his job earlier in the year to Mike Glennon, and I think that it's quite questionable right now that they're moving back to him. Now, obviously, Mike Glennon hasn't been great, but he's at least been getting the ball to the receivers. I mean, at least Mike Evans has looked very good over the past couple of weeks. Mike Evans has been a top 15 fantasy wide receiver over the past 3-4 weeks right now. And honestly, what sucks about this whole situation is that it could end up being better for Vincent Jackson than it is for Mike Evans. And we don't know that for sure. Obviously, Vincent Jackson has not been good lately. I mean, he's definitely been struggling from a fantasy standpoint, and there have been plenty of rumors that the Buccaneers were looking to move him at the trade deadline. That did not end up happening, obviously. But if he's going to get back on track, I do think it makes sense that he would get back on track now with a new quarterback. Although it is interesting that despite the fact that Mike Glennon was getting him the ball in 2013, that they just were not connecting here in 2014. So it'll be really interesting to see how that ends up working out. I'm not hugely sold on this being a positive move for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but they're such a bad team right now that it's hard to blame them for making a move and trying to make their team better. To me, I think it's a slight upgrade for Vincent Jackson, a slight downgrade for Mike Evans, but we'll have to see how it plays out on the field. That's just speculation based on what I saw at the beginning of the season, but I don't think it drastically changes the value of either of these players. So if you've got your Mike Evans and he's usually starting for you, if you've got a Vincent Jackson, he's usually starting for you, go ahead and keep him in your lineups. I don't think either player is a spectacular play this weekend, but you got to do what you've got to do if those guys are your normal options at the wide receiver position. Another story that I wanted to touch on here actually has to do with another wide receiver, and that is a future Hall of Famer. I don't think there's any question about that. Possibly one of the top 2 or 3 wide receivers that has ever played the game of football, and that is, of course, Randy Moss. Randy Moss, possible return here in 2014. He told ESPN, "I'm going to tell you this. For me to come out of retirement for a player such as Peyton Manning, I would consider that." Very, very interesting. The other thing is that he actually confirmed to Jay Glazer, that the Seahawks reached out to him after they traded Percy Harvin to the Jets. Now, Moss said that the reason that he walked away from football was not because he didn't have an offer. Obviously, he was getting offers, and even this year he's getting offers from the Seahawks, but it's not that he didn't have a physical ability either, but he actually had some personal family issues. So, Randy Moss still thinks he can play. And, it's hard to question that he can because the guy is just so ridiculously physically talented. I mean, he's so smart as a player. He doesn't have the speed anymore, and that was really his big calling card, but he's still got the size. He still has the strength of his hands. And like I said, he is one of the most legitimately, as far as NFL smarts go, there is almost every single teammate that he has ever played with has talked about that this guy is one of the smartest players that they have ever played with. So even at 37 years old, I still think Randy Moss can play in the NFL. Now, what it comes down to is if the Broncos are going to give him a look. Peyton Manning obviously is not the GM for the Broncos, but I'm sure if he got into John Elway's ear, we could actually see this move happen. But the question is, with Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, Wes Welker, Julius Thomas, is there really room for a guy like Randy Moss on the Denver Broncos offense? I mean, he hasn't played football since February of 2013. He's been an analyst for Fox now for, a year and a half now. And I question if they're going to make a move like that right now at this point in the season. Now, obviously, they're coming off a bad loss to the Patriots, but I don't think it's the type of situation where they're going to be looking to immediately make a major move at the wide receiver position, just because that's one of the most stacked positions on their entire roster. They've even got a couple of young guys who could step up and play if need be. So, while Randy Moss mentioned that he could possibly consider returning to the game if he got to play with the Peyton Manning, another option that he actually laid out on the line was that he would consider playing with Tom Brady again. And that one is pretty interesting because obviously the New England Patriots are hurting at wide receiver. They've really only got Julian Edelman and then a whole bunch of other guys that have been majorly disappointing. But given the fact that the Patriots traded him away, it'd be really hard for me to believe that he's going to be welcomed back into New England with open arms. I mean, obviously, I know he's talked repeatedly about how much respect he has for Belichick and Brady, but even still, you look at that whole thing about him getting traded away mid-season, and it just doesn't look good. It really doesn't. So I'm not expecting him to land onto the Patriots. I think it's more likely that he lands onto the Broncos, actually, and I think that would be a better situation for him. But either way, I'm not super excited about this. Fantasy owners, I don't think, should pay a whole lot of attention to this unless you're in an extremely deep league. I'm talking like 16 teams. And even as a huge Randy Moss fan myself, I'm just not sure that I would be excited about him even in that scenario until we actually see him practicing with the team and see what kind of reports are coming out about his speed and things like that, if he's still got it or not. But, just as a Randy Moss homer, this guy is legitimately one of my favorite football players that has ever stepped onto the field. I would love to see him play again. I mean, he's going to make it to the Hall of Fame at some point, so I'm not worried about that. But it would be amazing to see him back out there and possibly have a chance to win to win his first Super Bowl. It's crazy to think that he didn't win the Super Bowl that year with the Patriots. I just look back on it almost as that they did win the Super Bowl that year, that they won every single regular season game. What was it, 18-1 at the end of the year? Just brutal. The NFL is such a painful thing to watch sometimes when a team like the Giants wins the Super Bowl. I mean, no offense to the Giants fans that I know are listening to this, but it's so hard for me to say that they were the better team that year. I don't believe it. I mean, I think that the Patriots had a game that they lost by 3 points, and that was it. That was the one game that they lost the entire season. It was by 3 points. I think it's very clear that they were the best team that year, but hats off, I guess, to the Giants for winning the Super Bowl that year. But it sucks that a guy like Randy Moss is probably going to end up being one of the few players who is, one of the best players of all time at his position that never won a Super Bowl. But, he could return this year. He could end up winning a Super Bowl. What if he just wins a Super Bowl, like sitting on the bench for the Broncos or something like that? That would be hilarious. Or, coming back for the Patriots or something. But I do think it's also interesting that he did turn down that offer to the Seahawks because, the Seahawks, obviously, they won a Super Bowl last year. And they need some serious help at wide receiver. And he just turned them down flat. I don't know if it's because he doesn't want to play on a team that is coached in the way that they are, or maybe he doesn't want to play in that division, or maybe he doesn't want, I don't know. I have no idea what it is. Maybe he doesn't like Russell Wilson. I don't know. But it is very interesting that he turned down that deal with the Seahawks and said that he would play with the Patriots or the Broncos. So anyways, guys, let's get to the fan questions, because I know a lot of you had them this week, and I want to make sure that I answer as many of them as I can. If you are interested in asking me a fantasy question, be sure to send them to me either in the comment section of this YouTube video, or of course you can send them to me on Twitter at Kliquid TV. If you guys are sending me a question before Sunday's games, and obviously I'm not going to be able to put out another video prior to the kickoff of the games, so if you do it that way, I will do my best to respond to you via the comments or either in a response tweet, depending on which way you got in contact with me. I'm not going to guarantee that I will, but I will do my best to try and do that for you guys before the games kick off. So, first question comes from Martavis Daily on YouTube, and he wants to know, I have Demaryius Thomas, Jeremy Maclin, and Antonio Brown. What should I do with Randall Cobb? I kind of want to trade him. Great question. Now, first of all, this has to be like a 2-team league, because I think you are naming off each of the top 4 current fantasy wide receivers. I mean, Demaryius Thomas and Antonio Brown, I know, were 1 and 2. I think Jeremy Maclin, after his big game last week, moved up to number 3, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong on that. There might still be like a Jordy Nelson up there and stuff. But, I mean, these guys are all top 10 wide receivers right now. They're all wide receiver 1s. So I would absolutely, if you can't start 4 wide receivers a week, yes, I would definitely get rid of Randall Cobb. There's no reason to have him on your team. In fact, I would trade whichever one of these players will net you the most in return. So an Antonio Brown or a Demaryius Thomas probably will. You could pretty much get any running back for them, or just about any quarterback. So I would definitely consider doing that. Try and upgrade. Like I said, consolidate talent. You want to make sure that you have the best possible starting lineup going forward. Next question comes from 37 Will Dog on YouTube, and he asks, should I start Cam Newton against Philadelphia or Matt Stafford against Miami? Now, I think that this is an interesting one because I always like playing players on Monday Night Football. I don't know what it is, especially offensive players. I think that it's good because the offensive coordinators can typically get that extra day to actually, implement a game plan and make their players comfortable and go over game film and things like that. And Cam Newton against Philadelphia is a really great matchup. Philadelphia's defense is not good at all, but given the fact that Cam Newton was as bad as he was this past week, and he's been bad for most of the season. He hasn't been a quarterback one. And given that fact, I am going to go with Matt Stafford, who will have Calvin Johnson back this week. Stafford has struggled. It's true. He's had his games where he's been up. He's had his games where he's been down. And most of the time, it's been a borderline QB1. So neither of these guys has been living up to the expectations that we had of them going into the season. But if you ask me this week which one is more likely to have a big game, I am going to go with Matt Stafford. It sounds like Calvin Johnson is close to being fully healthy, and with Calvin Johnson being fully healthy, I mean, the sky is the limit for Matt Stafford. He could put up 400 yards. I mean, I know Miami's defense is good, and they're probably going to get after him plenty, but Matt Stafford has an amazing arm, and Calvin Johnson is going to be looking to just remind people that he is still the best receiver in the league. So I fully expect Matt Stafford to have a solid game this week. I am playing him myself in a couple of leagues, so if that helps you with any sort of confidence that I have in Matt Stafford, I do like him this week. I think that he will have a good enough week to be a quarterback one. Next question from D. Dwayne 17899 on YouTube, and he asks, who do you think is the better pickup for this week? Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Evans, or Martavis Bryant? Now, we talked a little bit about Mike Evans before. I think that he takes a slight downtick this week as far as his overall value goes. I am actually going to go with Martavis Bryant, who has been red hot since being activated and finally getting some playing time here for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Ben Roethlisberger is the hottest quarterback in football right now. 12 touchdowns in his past 2 games. I mean, that's an NFL record. The guy's unfreaking believable right now, and he's targeting Martavis Bryant a ton when they get into the red zone. The Jets secondary also one of the absolute worst in the entire league right now. They are just atrocious in their secondary. So I like Big Ben's opportunity this week. I do think that he's going to put up good numbers again. Don't expect 6 touchdowns, but I think Martavis Bryant probably has the best opportunity of this group to get into the end zone. I like Odell Beckham Jr. as well, but I have him as my number 2 on this list of 3, if that helps you out. But just given the fact that he might see some of Richard Sherman, I don't love that. So I hope that helps you out. Next question from Jason Kirk on YouTube. He asks, should I trade Alfred Morris and Demaryius Thomas for Randall Cobb and Jamal Charles? And I think it really comes down to the makeup of your roster. I had mentioned in the comments, I asked him a little bit more about that trade. And what it came back was that he had a solid team, but I do think that he needed to make an upgrade at running back. So I said yes to this trade. I think that Demaryius Thomas is definitely an upgrade over Randall Cobb. But like I mentioned before, I still view Randall Cobb as a wide receiver 1. So if he's, a top 10, top 12 wide receiver, and Demaryius Thomas is either the number 1 or the number 2 receiver, yeah, I mean, Randall Cobb is probably, I do think that I would rather have Demaryius Thomas, but I don't think it's nearly as big of a drop-off as it is when you go from Jamal Charles to an Alfred Morris. Jamal Charles might be the number 1 fantasy running back right now. So I maybe other than DeMarco Murray, he's certainly top 3, I think, right now, at least at the running back position. And Alfred Morris has been pretty disappointing. He's had some good games, but really nothing spectacular, and he has had some awful games. So I think that the upgrade from Alfred Morris to Jamal Charles is big enough that I would be willing to take the slight downtick at wide receiver from a Demaryius Thomas to a Randall Cobb. Next question from Beast Gone Gamer on YouTube, and he asks, should I start Sammy Watkins over Alshon Jeffrey? And I am going to say yes on this with a little bit of a caveat. Unfortunately, Sammy Watkins is dealing with a little bit of a groin injury that he sustained in the last game. It kept him out of practice on Thursday and Friday, so he's actually listed as questionable right now. You need to make sure before you set your lineup that he is going to be playing, because obviously if he's not playing, you need to make sure that you've got Alshon Jeffrey in there. I was going to say Brandon Marshall. I don't mix the two up very often, but sometimes I do. They're on the same team. But anyways, make sure obviously that Sammy Watkins is available for you in your roster on Sunday, because if he's not, we're going to go with Alshon Jeffrey. Now, Watkins did have a few good games in a row, and I know that Kansas City's defense is pretty solid, but it just looks like Alshon Jeffrey is kind of the forgotten guy right now in their offense, and I'm not loving what Jay Cutler is putting down. And given the fact that Green Bay's defense is actually pretty decent as far as their secondary goes, I am going to say, like I said, Sammy Watkins. I do think that the Chiefs are going to give up a decent number of passes in this game to Sammy Watkins, just given the fact that I think Kyle Orton's going to target him probably 10 times in this contest. So look for Watkins to have plenty of opportunities to make plays. If he makes 5 catches, that'll probably be good enough to make him a solid fantasy player for Week 10. Next question comes from Cameron Lynch on YouTube, and he asks, should I give up DeMarco Murray and Josh Gordon for Calvin Johnson and Rashad Jennings? And again, when you're asking a question like this, I really need to know what your record is. And the reason for it is because if you need to win this week, I'm keeping DeMarco Murray because I think he has an amazing chance to absolutely destroy the Jaguars. And I have a lot of faith in Calvin Johnson. I mentioned it before. I do think that he's going to be a solid player this week, but we don't know that he's going to be full speed yet. And because of that, you could end up getting a 3 from Calvin Johnson, and Rashad Jennings not going to play this week. So if you get nothing out of Calvin, and you're not going to have any points out of Rashad Jennings, you're basically losing out on DeMarco Murray's point total this week against one of the worst teams in the league. I definitely think that if you need the win this week, if you're a team that's vying for a playoff spot and you haven't quite secured it yet, if you're not sitting at, a 7-2 or an 8-1, if you're at a 6-3, I think it's borderline, but anything below a 6-3, if you're at 4-5, 5-4, 3-5, anything like that, you need to win this week. There's no question about it. You need to get a W, and that would be why I'm keeping DeMarco Murray. If you are at one of the situations where you're a better team, then I think I would probably actually do this trade because DeMarco Murray, I think, is going to be in for a little bit of a regression for the remainder of the season. I think Calvin Johnson's going to come back and be a top 10 wide receiver, and I think Rashad Jennings has a good opportunity once he gets back on the field to be a top 10 running back. He is going to get his job back. Andre Williams has been disappointing, and it looks like once he comes back, he's going to get the vast majority of the carries. So I'm not worried about the fact that he's going to be, conceding any significant carries to any other player in the offense, and that's always a good thing, despite the fact that the Giants aren't spectacular. So basically, I think you're getting 2 top 10 players at their position for DeMarco Murray, who, granted, is probably the number 1 overall player in fantasy football if we were redrafting right now. Well, maybe number 1. I don't know. You might go with like an Andrew Luck or a Peyton Manning or, like a Demaryius Thomas or an Antonio Brown. But, I mean, certainly the number 1 running back right now, I think, DeMarco Murray. And I get it if you want to keep him, but I do think that you're getting a good return on that investment. I don't really look at Josh Gordon as being anything significant. We still don't know that he's going to come back this year. I mean, there's no guarantee that he plays. I understand that he's going to be coming off of suspension, it sounds like, but even then, do we know that the Browns are going to immediately activate him? Does he know the playbook? I mean, he has no rapport whatsoever with what they're currently doing. So, I mean, I think Josh Gordon obviously has the physical skills to step in and be good, but is he going to be, a Calvin Johnson level player? No, absolutely not. I mean, I question if he's even going to be a wide receiver too when he returns. So again, like I said, it's going to come down to where you're currently sitting as far as your record goes, and then you need to kind of make a decision based upon that. So, next question comes from Colton Fruling on YouTube, and he asks, should I start Matt Stafford or Jay Cutler? And just like I mentioned before, I have a pretty good amount of faith this week in Matt Stafford putting up a decent game, even against a solid Miami defense. I don't really love what Jay Cutler has been doing, and just the fact that he's been so inconsistent makes me question if he's going to be good in this game on the road in a hostile environment of Green Bay. He hasn't been good there in the past. So I am going to go with Matt Stafford with Calvin Johnson being back. Next question from Madden for Life on YouTube. He asks me to pick 2 of this group: Kendall Wright, Fred Jackson, Percy Harvin, and Brandon Cooks. Now, he didn't mention the scoring system. I am going to assume that it's PPR just given the players that he has here. But I am going to say that I'm probably sitting Fred Jackson, and I'm probably sitting Kendall Wright out of this group. And the reason for it, Percy Harvin had a monster game this past week, got a ton of touches. I don't expect that to happen quite again, but I do think that he's going to touch the ball 6 to 8 times in this game, and that should be plenty enough for him to be a solid fantasy contributor for you. And Brandon Cooks is my second guy because they're playing at home. New Orleans just plays a lot better at home. Brandon Cooks has played way better at home as well, so I expect him to have a solid day. I don't expect him to have a touchdown in this game, but 6-7 catches would not be out of the question at all for him, and that would be enough for him to put up a solid fantasy day for you as well. Next question comes from @StayAwayJerk on Twitter, and he says that he is looking for a quarterback on the bye week for Tom Brady. He has Tony Romo, and he's considering Carson Palmer. Now, I'm going to say yes on this. I am going to sit Tony Romo for Carson Palmer. And the reason for it, I'm obviously a Dallas Cowboys fan. Everybody knows that. But we don't know how Romo is going to look when he comes back in this game. He missed last week's game. And, really, they could have used him. They really, really could have used him. So the fact that he sat tells me that he is not anywhere near being 100%. I think we're probably getting an 80%, 70, 80% Tony Romo, which is certainly better than Brandon Weeden. But is it better than Carson Palmer, who has been very, very good as of late, throwing multiple touchdowns and not throwing very many interceptions either? I don't think so. So I am going to go with Carson Palmer. I think this is a decent opportunity to get a guy like Carson Palmer into your lineup, just given the fact that Tony Romo is still hurt. Let's give it another week on Tony Romo and just make sure that he is what we expect him to be before we start putting him back in our fantasy lineups over a guy like Carson Palmer. Last question from you guys comes from Conchi Bear 53 on Twitter, and he asks me to give him 3 starters out of this group. It's a standard scoring league, so no PPR. He has Steve Smith, Odell Beckham, Larry Fitzgerald, and Mike Wallace. Now, I know Larry Fitzgerald has just been tearing it up lately, so he is definitely going to be in this group. 12 catches for 230 yards and a touchdown over his past 2 games. We just talked about Carson Palmer being an absolute beast as of late, so I am definitely going to go with Larry Fitzgerald, given the fact that Michael Floyd has pretty much been forgotten about in that offense, and the Rams are actually very, very good at stopping the deep ball, which is kind of where Michael Floyd makes his money. So I expect this to be a nice game for Larry Fitzgerald. The other 2 guys that I'm going to go with here are Mike Wallace and Steve Smith. I know they've been held out of the end zone, each of them, for the past couple of weeks, but they're still very clearly the top targets in their offenses, and I like that. I just like the guaranteed wide receiver 1 of the offense. So that to me is something that I am not going to overlook. I understand Odell Beckham had a huge game this past week, and I guess he's the odd man out here again. I like him enough, guys. Trust me, I'm not hating on Odell Beckham. It kind of sounds like I'm a Giants hater right now, but I'm really not. I like Odell Beckham. I just don't like him better than these guys. I think that you have 4 good options here, but I am going to go with the more veteran players here just because we haven't seen enough from Odell Beckham to be starting him against the Seattle Seahawks defense. I understand Seattle's defense isn't what it was last year, but they've still allowed the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and you never really know what they're going to do. They could just decide Richard Sherman's going to be on Beckham all day, and then what? Richard Sherman is, I understand that he's allowed a few catches this year, but dude's still a top 3 cornerback. He is just a dominant player, and I don't see Odell Beckham being the guy that tears him up, especially with Eli Manning at quarterback. So to me, it's pretty obvious I'm sitting Beckham. If you look at it next week, and you see that Mike Wallace or Larry Fitzgerald or Steve Smith don't put up the numbers that you expect them to, and Odell Beckham has a solid game, go ahead and play him going forward if that's what you want to do, but I just don't love this matchup against Seattle. So, guys, that is going to do it for the questions. I want to give you one final thing, and that is our busts and sleepers of the week. Of course, guys, if you're new to the show, what the bust is the player who I believe should not be in your fantasy lineup this week. He's a person who is normally a starter for your fantasy team, but somebody who should be sitting on the bench this week. And then the sleeper is kind of the opposite of that. That's a player that is not normally in your lineup, but probably should be for this week's games. So my bust of the week this week is a guy that I talked a little bit about before, and that is Jay Cutler up against the Green Bay Packers. Now, he's been on a cold streak lately. Just absolutely not looking good, inaccurate, throwing too many interceptions, and not getting the type of offensive production that we expect out of this awesome offense. On paper, these guys are as good as it gets, but he has been atrocious at Lambeau Field over the course of his career. The weather is going to be very, very cold, which is rarely a good thing for passing, and Jay Cutler just doesn't tend to perform as well in the very cold weather. So the Packers defense, I know it's been bad this year, but their secondary hasn't been horrible. They're kind of middle of the pack in terms of points given up to opposing quarterbacks, and they're 24th against the run. So I expect to see a lot of Matt Forte in this game. I think that he has a solid game, probably over 100 total yards and a touchdown, but I don't expect big numbers from Jay Cutler. I think there are plenty of other good options at quarterback. We talked about Carson Palmer. We talked about the Matt Staffords and those type of guys. I think that both those guys, Carson Palmer, Matt Stafford, and that type of player should probably be in your lineup over a Jay Cutler in your standard sized fantasy football leagues. Sleepers of the week, I actually have two of them this week. The first one is Bobby Rainey, and I know he's kind of a borderline, and that's why I made two of them here. I think Bobby Rainey, given the fact that he is now the starter for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is he's kind of interjected himself as being a borderline RB2 on a week-to-week basis, but I think he's better than that this week. I think he's almost a borderline running back 1. Given the fact that he looked really good against Cleveland last week. I mean, he ran for 87 yards on 19 attempts, and he also had 34 yards receiving, and that was his first game really as the starter in quite a few weeks here. He's a solid PPR option. This is a guy that could make 4, 5, 6 catches in this week's game, and Atlanta's defense is dead last in fantasy points per game given up to opposing running backs this season. So I definitely like Bobby Rainey. Like I said, I think I have him somewhere probably between 11th to 13th, somewhere in that range at the running back position this week. So he could definitely put up good numbers, and he is certainly good enough to be in your lineup this week. Next player is Michael Rivera, and that is the Oakland Raiders tight end. And I know, Oakland Raiders, why would you start an Oakland Raider against Denver? Well, he's coming off of the two best performances of his entire career, back-to-back weeks. This guy has put up good numbers. I think if I saw the number correctly, I think he made 15 of the 20 catches on 15 of the 20 passes that went his way. Derek Carr is looking his way a lot for a tight end, and tight ends tend to be the safety blanket for the young quarterbacks, and no wide receiver on that team has been super consistent. Obviously, James Jones and Andre Holmes have been, the top guys there, but neither of them is super consistent. And we're starting to see that he is creating that rapport with a Michael Rivera, and I do think that he is going to be a solid play this week against Denver. Oakland is going to have to pass a lot to stay in this game, and I think that it's very possible that Derek Carr could approach 50 attempts this week. And if he throws the ball 50 times, I would not be surprised to see Michael Rivera get another 10 targets going his way. And if he gets targeted 10 times in a game and makes 5 or 6 catches on that, that's probably good enough to be a solid tight end 1 this week with a good possibility of scoring a touchdown. So I hope that helps you guys out. I really hope that you guys get these players into your lineup and take Jay Cutler out of your lineup if you can. I'm not expecting big things out of him. So guys, that is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned something. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button, and also be sure to press the subscribe button as well so that you can be updated when I put out the next episode of the show. If you have any questions about your lineups for this week's games, or if you're thinking about making a trade, or if you just have any general fantasy football questions, please be sure to leave those in the comment section below or tweet them to me at Kliquid TV. Try to give me some time before the games start so that I can respond to you guys in a timely fashion. Thank you guys so much for listening, and be sure to check back next week for a recap of Week 10, and I will, of course, be giving you guys some predictions for the rest of the season here on the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. Good luck, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.